This is the third part in a four-part series going over the common myths, lies, and misconceptions within the canon of Marxism-Leninism. In this part, we will be discussing the Kronstadt Rebellion. In 1921, at the tail end of the Russian Civil War, there was a huge strike wave throughout Petrograd and Moscow. In the south, the largest peasant uprising, known as the Tambov Rebellion, had been going on for the past year in response to Bolshevik incursions on their land and food stocks. In Petrograd, sailors from the military port at Kronstadt, standing in solidarity with the striking workers, revolted against the Bolsheviks on the 1st of March. This came after months of negotiation proposing a list of demands to the government to challenge the consistency of their constitution. As would be the trend going forward, the army would give no quarter, and by the 18th of March, the revolt had been crushed. What's interesting about the defense in the crushing of Kronstadt is that it's one of the few which is shared with Trotskyists as well, mainly because the old man still had some semblance of power at the time. Compared with the Nazi Pact and Holodomor, Kronstadt tends to be avoided a little bit more by Leninists. It has a much more specific socialist orientation compared with the broader geopolitics of the former two, so you don't get much more than a fleeting reference about it in mainstream discussion. The topic holds a lot more prominence instead within anarchist canon, due to the ideas playing a large role of influence amongst the fleet. Apologism for Soviet actions tends to occur in a finely laid out series of layers. Firstly, and traditionally, they start off with the claim that the rebels were in alliance with the White Army. There is no proof of white infiltration. For decades, Leninists dismissed the revolt as a white plot, not through evidence, but through an unreliable newspaper statement Trotsky pointed to after the fact, which appears to showcase that the revolt had been spoken about 2 weeks prior in the Western press. Cursory interpretations might lead you to think that this has merit, but it actually makes no sense. Why would the Western powers have revealed the White Army's intentions and even apparent downfall to the public before it even occurred? Evidently more so considering the enemies had access to these papers. This is a conspiratorial level claim. The Bolsheviks had stated in the past that the Western press had been printing a web of lies regarding what was going on past the pale, and considered them to be most untrustworthy reportings, which is why Trotsky never cared much for the report when it first came out. Using the fewest assumptions, it's highly likely that this is much more a reference to the ongoing February unrest. This would continue to be the main line, until a so-called piece of evidence appeared in 1970, apparently showing definitive proof of a white plot. But there's really not much to it. It's largely an analysis from the fledgling white forces claiming that the sailors might revolt soon, not a plan set in motion by them. The founder, Paul Average, of which a lot of Kronstadt sourcing begins, himself admits that this is not evidence of the whites forming a revolt, and is merely a circumstantial analysis. This was later confirmed after the crushing by White Colonel George Elfringren, who clearly admits that the revolt was spontaneous and against their wishes. Proponents will then claim that the sailors of 21 were not the same hardened revolutionaries of 1917, but rather had been replaced by backwards peasants, mainly recruited in Ukraine. There is some proof of this, not necessarily on the backwardsness, but there does appear to be some evidence towards some of the Baltic fleet being of a different makeup. I did notice some time ago that Israel Getzler's reporting on the fleet had a bad interpretation of the source attached to it. After looking at some other reports, it does appear to me, as of present, that there was a different makeup of at least some of the fleet, though many veterans did remain and they led from the front. Nevertheless, this point is irrelevant. Why? Because A, the sailors not being the ones who helped the Bolsheviks in 1917 doesn't prove anything as to the government actions being correct. And B, it doesn't say whether or not the replacements didn't support the Bolsheviks 4 years prior. Simply that they were new recruits. And so the interpretation made is that if they were part of the old guards, they would have obviously supported the Bolsheviks, no questions asked. Yes, they were certainly not known as a rebellious and unruly lot. Get real. As late as 1920, the government was still praising them as the backbone of the revolution. Ideas are what are important, be they from novices or old-timers. If you are interested, though, the majority of the committee entrusted to the Kronstadt fleet were of Russian descent. After this, the next line of attack points to the supposed anti-Semitic character of the revolt. The evidence for anti-Semitism relies on 3 sources. Firstly, the Bolshevik accounts of Vershinin of the Kronstadt Committee, who allegedly stated to the Red Army detachment on March 8th, prior to his capture, "Join with us and beat the Jews." The second comes from a memoir of a sailor. Due to a lot of sourcing being hard to find in this area, I can't access the original source as to whether he was even based at Kronstadt at the time or not. He called the Bolshevik demands the ultimatum of the Jew Trotsky. The third source is a bit more substantial. It's a letter from a sailor caught by the Petrograd Censorship Board, which allegedly states that the mutineers had made a resolution to ship the Jews off to Palestine. At first, this appears pretty damning. On closer inspection, there's quite an error. Not a single witness or documentation exists pertaining to a resolution ever being passed or even made by the committee both times they convened. Considering concurrent Soviet elections after the establishment of the Commune, initiatives would have been recorded. What can we make of this letter then? Well, with the fewest assumptions, I can presume that these are probably the fantastical, hopeful ramblings of an anti-Semite to his family. Not much more of substance than that. What's interesting about these assertions is how fleeting they are, considering the USSR's 70-year reign and chances to defame them. One could make the comparison. If you can clearly see the opportunism of trying to inflate anti-Semitic harassment under the Corbyn administration based on 1 or 2 individuals in a party staff of thousands, then why such selective vigor when applied here? Russia is the land of the pale, home of the hundreds. Even within the Bolsheviks themselves, you can find evidence of Jew hatred. And Trotsky, of all people, was very much okay rehabilitating a raging anti-Semitic general. We would have expected larger scales of anti-Semitism present from a reactionary movement instead of just meagre examples. To stretch a few instances as representative of the entire fleet makes these claims appear pedantic, derisory, and opportune, in absence of the larger systemic racism present. However, the sources do appear to showcase some contingent of anti-Semites within the fleet. It did number in the tens of thousands after all. If this is accurate, it doesn't present the most immaculate reception upon all of the sailors. But if we simply take it for granted that this is correct, for the pro-Bolshevik position it only grants them a single thing, that the supporters of the more positivist line, normally that of anarchist persuasion, are in need of some re-evaluation. It again says absolutely nothing as to the intentions or nature of the Bolsheviks. There is nothing in Lenin or Trotsky's excuses which even acknowledges such behavior. They still would have put down the revolt, Jew-hating contingents or not. And we know it for a fact because of the observed final line of defense that pro-Bolsheviks rest on when they don't have any other excuse at hand. Like many Soviet defenses, it's wholly defeatist. It wasn't a feasible alternative. Without proper party discipline, the revolution would have collapsed. There was no alternative. The Russian Civil War was indeed a rough time, but go and ask any reputable historian, by this point in the conflict there was no real threat to Western Russia, not even by the most stringent estimates. On the front, Wrangel's forces had been summarily routed and defeated. The Western powers, who had harbored at the key ports of Arkhangelsk and Vladivostok, had since left, and by the beginning of that year, over half of the Red Army had been demobilized. What threats still remained by this point amounted to effectively loose threads who had virtually zero support from any outside backer. Even still, I understand that the question of safeguarding a revolution is very much a common cause of contention amongst a lot of left-wingers, so let's talk about it. This scenario might be understandable to the contemporary Bolshevik perspective, but in determining whether we are still to hold that view legitimate, we have the luxury of hindsight. Despite it staring us in the face, we often tend to overlook something very important. The fact that the USSR eventually did degrade and dissolve, and was subsumed by Western capital. Depending on your flavor of Leninism, that might have begun in the 1920s with the so-called takeover of the bureaucracy. For others, that might be 1953 with the death of Stalin and the Khrushchev Fall. And for a few, it might be 1985 with the rise of Gorbachev and the Glasnost period. But these issues came about due to contradictions of their own making. You can harp around about external influence all you want, but it only gets you so far. And this degeneration all occurred despite such mass discipline being so rigidly enforced. So with this in mind, why then would a relatively small group making demands of greater autonomy and the upholding of the government's promises have really been that much of an issue in the long term of things? Could it have led to the whites retaking power? Like I've said, there's a remote possibility. It's much more likely that it would have opened a path towards the eventual communism that we all want. The only thing we do know for certain is history. Saying that there was no alternative when your method also degraded never led to an opening of self-actualization, and perhaps even destroyed the very bases that could have prevented capitalist revanchism, doesn't really stand up to present scrutiny. They don't allow this because adherents would then have to contend that their legacy had foundational errors in theory. And that would mean adapting their ideology far beyond anything worth defending. Is it any surprise, then, as to why so much of modern Marxism-Leninism must present the stagnation as coming from factors purely of outside interference? We also can't ignore when going through these arguments that there's a supreme degree of bad faith. Do you notice something about this? If bad timing were the only issue, at what point would it have been acceptable? There isn't one. If you've decided that any factionalism could potentially pose a threat and give support to the enemy, then there's no point in time at which such avenues could ever be allowed. Notice something else? This argument contradicts the other three, yet it's still often used in conjunction with them, thrown in at the very end if all the other statements fail. It all comes across as rather slimy and disingenuous, as if such people are frothing at the mouth going through paper after paper trying to find something to throw at them, regardless of whether refutation of any of those points would even change their mind. As said, it's one thing for Marxist-Leninists to defend this. It's actually quite funny when Trotskyists do it as well, seeing as it showcases a huge hypocrisy. Whether you like it or not, Trotskyists and Marxist-Leninists have a lot more in common than they care to admit. It's just that the direction of how to lead the USSR after Lenin croaked led to a bit of butthurt whining. Trots will hound Marxist-Leninists for thinking that they knew what was best after Trotsky's forced vacation, yet defend and make excuses for any terror committed under their ideology. The left opposition of which Trotsky headed was, by and large, still within the same Leninist camp which Stalin was. They both supported a democratic centralist structure which supposedly upheld the interests of the people being carried out by a proletarian nucleus. In other words, not by the working class themselves, just an advanced cadre on their behalf. There's a lot of big-headedness, shall we say, within Leninism. I think the word advanced is a shining showcase of that. This could always be used to justify crushing disagreement, because you're doing so in the name of the proletariat. In exchanges I've had with Trotskyists especially, they always appear to have some unilateral faith in the party, as if because the party may have had popular support in 1917, that must therefore mean they represented the will of the entire proletariat indefinitely. Why would this still necessarily apply in 1921? If the left opposition had won out, would Trotsky have still had legitimacy by 1960? This was echoed by Maurice Brinton, who writes that in trying to monopolize Stalinist opposition, they unknowingly weakened their own case. For if the demands of workers' management of production were wrong in 1921, why did they become partially correct in 1923? If in 1921 Lenin and Trotsky represented the real interests of the workers against the actual workers, why couldn't Stalin? Why couldn't Kadar in 1956? The Trotskyist school of hagiography has helped obscure the real lessons of the struggle against the bureaucracy. At least MLs have the decency to eat the whole cake. Trots really ought know better. Now, no revolt is necessarily destined to succeed, but that's not why we support revolts and opposition in the first place. We do so on an ideological basis. If you want to base it on the chances of success, know that the same logic could also have been placed on the February and October revolutions in light of nationwide war fatigue. Moreover, we talk about it because of what it represents. A mass of spontaneously organized people who were trying to fight for their basic human interests, and the promises of the October Revolution, against the authority of the land. At a time when peace was just on the horizon, this was the perfect opportunity for the Bolsheviks to prove their worth and principles. Instead, they flat out destroyed it. They showcased exactly who was in charge, and what would be expected going forward. The sailors don't need to be the most perfect individuals for that to be any less true. Why are such standards never held for the individual Bolsheviks themselves? Last time I highlighted this common line which MLs tend to use in defenses of atrocities, and I think it encapsulates the Kronstadt topic perfectly. It can really be boiled down to a question of legitimacy. Certainly from the perspective of the Bolsheviks, the Kronstadt sailors were traitors. They were fighting against their rules. It makes perfect sense for the government to be opposing those who are fighting against them. That's simply where their interests lie. But from the strikers and sailors, the Bolsheviks were the ones who had betrayed the revolution, and so they are fighting for their interests. Just like the Bolsheviks were fighting against the provisional government before them. Marxist-Leninists love to do this strange relativism with attacks on their sides. During the Hungarian Revolution, rebels indiscriminately attacked various officials and police officers. This is described in party lines as lynching communists, as if the fact that they were citizens attacking people who held power over them and were actively intruding in their lives maybe didn't warrant an inclusion in that description. The fact that this was largely in response to a state massacre in Moshe Madyarova didn't seek a mention either. What is the purpose of state security? It's not to protect ordinary people, that's for sure. Just because somebody is a threat to you, just because you have anxieties, doesn't mean that they're in the wrong, nor that your side is justified. Since the Bolsheviks were the state, it was on them to prove their actions legitimate. It's 2025 now, and we are not Bolsheviks. We have to decide for ourselves whose interests we consider legitimate in light of all the hindsight. That's a hell of a big question for this video, and if you already do align with Leninism, then you've probably already decided your answer. For me, given the Bolshevik actions during this period, and that it led to an apparatus that would always put down any attempt at progressive change, I'm in the camp that the sailors' demands at the least couldn't have resulted in anything worse than what came about. Some people, including the late Mark Fisher, push down on the constant bringing up of Kronstadt over and over again, and that we need to move on. But that completely neglects the reasons for why we continue to interpret the past. Kronstadt is something we all ought to bear in mind were a future similarity to occur. If a revolution just ends with some small cadre taking power, then me having to get in line and shut up and just trust that a hierarchy I have no control over will be my saviors, I can also see myself fighting back. What can I say? That's just where my interests lie. Authority, after all, is not self-justifying. In the final part of this series, we will be going over the history of the deportations within the USSR.